On a frosty morning in 1905, in the Tsushima Strait, Admiral Togo Hihikairo stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Mikasa, watching as the Russian battleships, one by one, vanished beneath the waves. The overwhelming victory of the Imperial Japanese Navy over the Russian 2nd Pacific Squadron was more than just a tactical masterpiece, it was the birth of a legend. It was in this moment of absolute triumph that a myth was forged in steel and seawater, a belief in the invincibility of Japanese warships that would define the nation's naval psyche for 4 decades. "Our ships are invincible," the admiral might have whispered, never knowing that this monumental victory was sowing the seeds of a future catastrophe. The Battle of Tsushima became the sacred text of the Imperial Japanese Navy. It was a victory so total, so decisive, that it seemed to confirm a divine mandate. From it, Admiral Togo articulated a philosophy that would echo through the ranks for generations: the gods bestow the crown of victory upon those who have already won through peacetime preparation. This sentiment crystallized into the Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle doctrine. The entire strategic and psychological framework of the Japanese Navy became fixated on a single, apocalyptic clash of battleships that would, like Tsushima, determine the fate of nations in a single afternoon. Every ship designed, every cadet trained, and every resource allocated was done with this singular engagement in mind. This military doctrine was powerfully reinforced by a deeper, almost mystical, cultural conviction. Many Japanese officers and sailors believed their ships were protected by the kamikaze, or divine wind. This was the same sacred force, a pair of powerful typhoons, that had twice saved Japan from Mongol invasion fleets in the 13th century. The belief was that the gods who had guarded the nation's shores for centuries would now extend their protection to the steel hulls of its modern fleet. This was not mere metaphor, it was a deeply ingrained faith that transformed these warships from instruments of state power into symbols of a divine destiny. The steel giants were not just formidable fighting machines, they were sacred vessels shielded by providence. This profound confidence permeated every level of the Navy. It was a tangible feeling, an atmosphere of absolute certainty that surrounded the fleet. One contemporary sailor captured this mindset perfectly: "We boarded the ship thinking it would never sink. It was covered with the best thick steel, so it had to be safe." This fusion of technological pride, historical precedent, and spiritual faith created a powerful, yet blinding, hubris. The victory at Tsushima, instead of being studied as a unique confluence of strategy, technology, and enemy weakness, was mythologized. It became proof of an inherent superiority, a national and even racial destiny to rule the waves. This myth of unsinkability, born in the waters of Tsushima and nurtured by the belief in a divine wind, would grow unchecked, leading Japan to build ever larger, more formidable battleships, each one believed to be more indestructible than the last. As the 1930s dawned, the world was unknowingly on the brink of a new naval arms race, and Japan was determined to win it not through numbers, but through sheer, overwhelming power. The spirit of Tsushima had evolved. The faith in divine protection and superior training was now being forged into unprecedented physical form. This was the era of the super battleship, a time when the Imperial Japanese Navy, constrained by naval treaties and a smaller industrial base than its primary rival, America, adopted a doctrine of quality over quantity. The philosophy was simple and audacious: if you cannot outbuild your enemy, then build individual ships so powerful, so heavily armed and armored, that they are functionally invincible. The ultimate expression of this doctrine began to take shape in the deepest secrecy. In March 1934, Captain Kikuo Fujimoto, a brilliant and visionary naval architect, presented a concept that defied the imagination of the era: a battleship displacing a staggering 70,000 tons, armed with 9 colossal 18.1-inch guns, the largest ever mounted on a warship, and protected by a shell of armor up to 16 inches thick. This was the genesis of the Yamato class, warships designed to be unsinkable fortresses capable of engaging and destroying multiple enemy battleships simultaneously. They were conceived not just as weapons of war, but as the final arbiters of the Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle that would secure Japan's supremacy in the Pacific. The construction of these behemoths was cloaked in a level of secrecy that was almost fanatical. The Kure Naval Arsenal, where Yamato was built, was transformed into a fortress within a fortress. The construction dock was shielded by a massive curtain of sisal mats to prevent observation from the surrounding hills. Knowledge was dangerously compartmentalized. It was rumored that no single person in the entire shipyard had access to all the complete blueprints. This paranoia was so effective that even those building the ships were unaware of their true nature. Sakataro Nishihata, one of the vessel's constructors, would later confess in astonishment, "I was building the biggest ship in the world and did not know it until the end of the war." This intense secrecy nurtured the psychology of superiority within the Naval High Command. They were not merely building ships, they were creating a trump card so secret and so powerful that it would guarantee victory when finally revealed. Yet, even as the steel monsters took shape, a prescient voice of caution emerged from within the highest echelons of the Navy. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a man who understood the changing face of naval warfare better than most, harbored deep reservations about the battleship-centric doctrine. He famously warned, "The fiercest snake can be defeated by a swarm of ants," a thinly veiled metaphor for his belief that even the most powerful battleships were vulnerable to massed attacks by a new and ascendant weapon, the aircraft. His warning was a chilling premonition that the age of the naval gun was ending and the age of air power was beginning. For Yamamoto, the super battleships were magnificent, but they were also dinosaurs, symbols of a glorious past ill-suited for the wars of the future. The strategic gamble was immense. The resources poured into the Yamato and its sister ship, Musashi, were astronomical. The steel, labor, and industrial capacity they consumed came at a staggering opportunity cost. It is estimated that the same resources could have been used to construct 6 large aircraft carriers or as many as 45 modern destroyers. By choosing to build 2 invincible battleships, Japan deliberately sacrificed the very assets, carriers for air cover and destroyers for escort, that might have protected them. The die was cast. The Imperial Japanese Navy had staked its future on its steel monsters, convinced that their unparalleled power was the key to victory, unaware that their true vulnerability lay not in their armor, but in the very doctrine that created them. While Japan was perfecting its steel giants, convinced they were the ultimate arbiters of naval power, America was quietly forging a different kind of weapon in the crucible of the Pacific War. At the outset of the conflict, the U.S. submarine force was an often ineffective and frustrating arm of the Navy, plagued by faulty torpedoes, cautious doctrine, and a lack of reliable intelligence. The silent service was too often silent in its results. However, the brutal lessons of the war's early years forced a rapid and lethal evolution. From a scattered and underperforming asset, the American submarine fleet was being transformed into one of the most deadly and efficient fighting forces in naval history. This transformation was driven by a trinity of improvements: technology, tactics, and intelligence. The notoriously unreliable Mark 14 torpedoes, which often failed to detonate or ran deeper than set, were painstakingly fixed, turning them into the ship killers they were always meant to be. Tactically, American commanders began to shed their pre-war conservatism, adopting aggressive, wolf pack strategies that allowed multiple submarines to coordinate devastating attacks on enemy convoys and task forces. Most importantly, breakthroughs in signals intelligence gave American sub-captains an unprecedented view of Japanese fleet movements, allowing them to be in the right place at the right time to set a lethal ambush. The hunters were learning their craft. Embodying this new generation of underwater predator was the USS Sealion, SS-315, a Below-class submarine placed under the command of a determined 31-year-old lieutenant commander named Eli Thomas Reich. A 1935 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, Reich represented the modern, aggressive, and technically proficient leadership that was coming to define the submarine service. Under his command, the Sealion was destined to achieve a feat that no other American submarine would in the entire war: to sink an enemy battleship. The quiet and deadly effectiveness of this transformed force is captured in one of the most stunning statistics of the Pacific War. This small, elite branch, comprising a mere 2% of the total U.S. Navy, would ultimately be responsible for sinking over a third of the entire Japanese fleet, including warships and vital merchant shipping. They were the swarm of ants that Admiral Yamamoto had feared, methodically and relentlessly dismantling the foundations of the Japanese war effort from below the waves, far from the grand fleet-on-fleet actions envisioned by the Kantai-Kessen doctrine. Yet, the path of these hunters was not without its own profound tragedies, highlighting the brutal and often indiscriminate nature of submarine warfare. On September 12, 1944, the USS Sealion, in a tragic case of mistaken identity, attacked a Japanese convoy and sank 2 transport ships. Only later was it discovered that these were Hell ships carrying Allied prisoners of war. Of the 2,218 Australian and British POWs crammed into the holds, a staggering 1,559 perished. In a small but significant act of redemption, the Celian later returned to the scene and, amidst the wreckage, managed to rescue 54 of the survivors. This dark episode served as a grim reminder of the chaos of war, where the line between a legitimate target and a human catastrophe could be erased in the time it took for a torpedo to run its course. The underwater hunters were now ready, sharpened by experience, armed with deadly technology, and hardened by the grim realities of their deadly trade. They prowled the Pacific, a swarm of silent, patient predators preparing to challenge the fiercest of snakes. The myth of the unsinkable battleship, forged in a decisive victory at Tsushima and reinforced by decades of naval doctrine, was about to meet its violent end in the cold, dark waters of the Formosa Strait. The agent of its demise was not a grand fleet of rival dreadnoughts, but a lone, unseen hunter from the deep. On the moonless night of November 21, 1944, the USS Celian was prowling on the surface, its radar methodically sweeping the black horizon. At 20 minutes past midnight, a series of faint blips appeared on the screen. Commander Eli Reich had found his prey, a Japanese naval squadron moving at speed. For the next 3 hours, Celian skillfully shadowed the formation, maneuvering into a perfect attack position. In the periscope, the silhouettes were large, but the darkness and the distance played tricks on the eye. Here, the Japanese obsession with secrecy and masking the appearance of their capital ships paid a strange, ironic dividend. The crew of the Celian made a fateful misidentification, logging their primary target not as the formidable battleship it was, but as a heavy cruiser. They were stalking a giant, believing it to be a lesser beast. At 3:20, the order was given. Celian unleashed a spread of 6 torpedoes aimed at the second ship in the enemy line, the 30-year-old veteran battleship, Kongo. From the submarine's perspective, there were the 10 seconds of waiting, followed by the distant, satisfying thuds of multiple impacts. They knew they had hit their target, but the full magnitude of their achievement was yet to be understood. Aboard the Kongo, the explosions were a violent shock. 3 torpedoes had ripped into its hull. Yet, incredibly, the great ship absorbed the punishment. In a testament to its robust, British-designed construction, the battleship maintained speed and formation, steaming onward as if to prove the myth of its own invincibility. For 2 agonizing hours, it seemed the ship might survive. But below decks, a desperate and losing battle was being fought. As the artistic sketch of the event imagines, the captain stood on the bridge, feeling the life slowly drain from his command. The ship developed a heavy, irreversible list to port. Seawater, cold and black, cascaded into the boiler rooms, extinguishing the fires that gave the vessel its power. The crew fought with disciplined desperation to contain the flooding and correct the list, but the damage was too severe. The giant was bleeding out. Slowly, the Kongo lost speed and fell out of formation, coming to a dead stop in the water, a wounded, helpless behemoth. Then, at 5:24 a.m., the night erupted. With a blinding, volcanic flash, the Kongo's main artillery magazines detonated. The unsinkable giant simply disintegrated in a cataclysm of fire and steel. The explosion was so immense, so utterly final, that it created a pillar of smoke and flame that was reportedly visible from 100 miles away. In mere seconds, the warship that had served the Imperial Japanese Navy since the First World War vanished into the abyss. The human tragedy was as vast as the explosion itself. With the Kongo went 1,200 of her crew, including the division commander. The myth of invincibility died with them. In the chaos of the attack, one of the torpedoes from Celian's spread had also found another target, striking and sinking the escorting destroyer Urukays with all hands. A single American submarine, through a combination of skill, technology, and a crucial misidentification, had shattered a cornerstone of Japanese naval psychology. The crack in the armor of their belief system had appeared, and it was deep and irreparable. The loss of the Kongo sent a shockwave of disbelief and confusion through the highest levels of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The sinking was more than a tactical defeat, it was a psychological breach. A battleship, the very symbol of naval might and the centerpiece of the Kantai-Kessen doctrine, had been destroyed by what was considered a minor threat, a single, unseen submarine. For decades, their strategic thinking had been dominated by visions of titanic clashes between gun-bristling dreadnoughts. Now, that foundation was cracking. The High Command, which had so confidently placed its faith in the supremacy of its steel giants, was thrown into a state of profound disarray. If a veteran like Kongo could be so easily dispatched, were any of their ships truly safe? As the months wore on and the American war machine ground inexorably closer to the home islands, the remaining super battleships, Yamato and Musashi, languished in port, symbols of a power that the Navy seemed unable or unwilling to wield. This inaction did not go unnoticed. On March 29, 1945, during a briefing on the dire military situation, Emperor Hirohito posed a simple, yet devastatingly potent question to his naval chiefs: what is our Navy doing? This query was not a genuine request for information, it was understood by all present as an implicit and stinging criticism of the fleet's passivity. The Emperor's words carried the weight of a command, overriding all strategic and tactical objections. The Navy had to act. The greatest battleship ever built, the Yamato, would be given its final, desperate mission. The plan, codenamed Operation Tengo, was a suicidal charge into the heart of the American fleet at Okinawa. The pre-mission briefing for the officers of its escort squadron was an exercise in grim fatalism. Captain Tamichi Hara of the light cruiser Yahagi later described the atmosphere as extremely tense. When the details of the attack were laid out, a daylight run with no air cover against a fleet protected by thousands of aircraft, the assembled officers were unified in their opposition. They argued, pleaded, and reasoned, knowing it was a death sentence, but the decision, spurred by the Emperor's perceived wish, was final. The sense of doom was palpable, yet the warrior code of the samurai held fast. In a poignant anecdote that captures the spirit of the moment, the officers of the Yamato were reportedly given the opportunity to remain in port, to step away from a mission from which there would be no return. Despite the complete understanding of their vessel's certain destruction, not a single officer took the offer. They would share the fate of their ship. The end came with brutal, overwhelming swiftness. On April 7, 1945, the greatest battleship in history met its destiny not in a duel with other battleships, but against the very swarm of ants that Yamamoto had prophesied. Nearly 400 American carrier aircraft descended upon the Yamato and its meager escort. For 2 terrifying hours, the ship was savaged by a relentless storm of bombs and torpedoes. Its vaunted armor, designed to withstand battleship shells, was helpless against the onslaught from the air. The giant, which had been born in secrecy and shrouded in myth, was turned into a burning, twisted heap of scrap metal and sent to the bottom of the sea. The chain reaction that began with a submarine's torpedoes in the Formosa Strait had reached its brutal crescendo, and with the fall of the Yamato, the myth of the unsinkable Japanese battleship was finally and irrevocably destroyed. The wreckage of the Yamato on the floor of the East China Sea serves as more than just a war grave, it is a profound epitaph for an entire era of naval warfare and a stark monument to a catastrophic strategic delusion. The myth of the unsinkable battleship, born at Tsushima and nurtured for 40 years, did not merely lead to the loss of ships and men, it fundamentally warped Japan's strategic decision-making and arguably sealed its fate in the Pacific War. The unwavering belief in the supremacy of the battleship blinded the Imperial Japanese Navy's high command to the revolutionary shift in naval power that was happening right before their eyes. This blindness was not for a lack of warning. As early as 1940, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had a chillingly clear vision of the future. He predicted, "If we are ordered to fight, I can guarantee a fierce struggle for the first 6 months, but I have no confidence in what will happen if the war drags on for 2 or 3 years." His warning was rooted in his understanding of America's industrial might and, crucially, in his appreciation for the ascendant power of naval aviation. He understood that the age of the gun club dreadnought was over, and the age of the aircraft carrier had begun. Yet, his voice was largely a cry in the wilderness against a naval establishment still fixated on a single, decisive gun battle. The ultimate and bitter irony is that the magnificent Japanese battleships, the products of immense national effort and treasure, never fought the battle for which they were created. The Kantai Kessen, the climactic fleet-on-fleet engagement that was the sole justification for their existence, never materialized. Instead, these steel giants were either relegated to secondary roles, picked off by unseen submarines, or, in the case of Yamato, sent on a suicidal sortie against overwhelming air power, the very swarm of ants Yamato had feared. They were a solution to a problem that no longer existed. The price of this delusion was staggering. The resources consumed by these behemoths were immense. The fuel burned by the Yamato throughout its brief and largely inactive service life could have powered dozens of smaller, more versatile warships like destroyers and cruisers for actual combat operations. The steel, the labor, the industrial capacity, all were poured into a doctrine that was already obsolete, starving the fleet of the aircraft carriers and escort vessels it desperately needed to survive in the new reality of a three-dimensional naval war. The final, terrifying moments of this myth were captured by those who lived through its demise. Mitsuru Yoshida, a young radar officer who survived the sinking of the Yamato, chronicled the horror in his diary, writing with the clarity of a man facing the apocalypse, "This is not what the admirals promised us. No battleship, no matter how mighty, can survive against what is coming from the horizon." His words are a haunting testament from the heart of the catastrophe, the voice of a generation sacrificed to the hubris of their leaders. Today, the Yamato lies broken in the deep, a silent memorial to the 3,000 men who perished with it. It is a tombstone not only for a crew but for a concept. Its steel grave marks the definitive end of the battleship era, a powerful and tragic symbol of how a glorious past, when clung to too tightly, can ensure a disastrous future. The great ship, and the myth it embodied, never lived up to the impossible hopes placed upon it.